is Nikki Chiamarco. I'm a librarian with Pima County Public Library, and I'm a member of our Biblio Lotus team, whose mission is to support and value the culture and voice of Asian communities in Pima County by providing resources and programs, and by establishing ongoing partnerships with Asian organizations. We also highlight Asian and Asian American authors and voices as well. And I'm here talking with Michelle Yang, debut author of Phoenix Girl, How a Fat Asian with Bipolar Found Love. On Wednesday, May 14th from 5:30 to 7 p.m., Michelle will be at Martha Cooper Library in conversation with Rachel Spitz. Michelle will delve into her debut memoir, which chronicles her journey from a tight-knit ethnic Chinese enclave in South Korea to her new life in Phoenix, Arizona, and beyond. Um, in addition to being a translator for her parents, Michelle worked in her family's Chinese takeout restaurant starting at 12 years old, overcoming challenges and taking initiatives that shaped her into who she is today. With unflinching honesty, Phoenix Girl explores Michelle's struggle with Asian American identity, body image, mental health, and her eventual diagnosis with bipolar disorder. Ultimately, Michelle finds love, not only the romantic kind, but an enduring self-love, which allows her to heal, never give up, and thrive while successfully managing what later becomes a bipolar 1 diagnosis. Michelle's writing has been featured on NBC News, CNN, InStyle, Shondaland, and more. A proud University of Arizona alum, she is thrilled to return to Tucson for the special author talk that she'll be giving on May 14th. So, hi, Michelle.
Hi.
I'm so
Thanks.
excited. Oh, I'm so excited to talk with you about your debut book. Um, and I do love that you mentioned and gave a shout out to libraries and how important they were to you several times in your book. Um, and I did want to say that during the pandemic, I read a book by Catherine Cho called Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness. And this was about her challenges with postpartum psychosis and staying in a psychiatric hospital. But besides that, I don't really recall seeing many books written by AAPI authors that deal so directly and so honestly with vulnerability, really, in the way that you did about mental health and depression and your bipolar disorder. So I wanted to find out, I guess, when did you first know that you wanted to write your memoir and share your story with the world?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Nikki. That wonderful intro. It's a pleasure to be on here with the library. The library really does have such a special place in my heart. Affected my life in such a strong, powerful way. And as far as when I knew that I wanted to write my memoir, it really was I was having a midlife crisis, to be honest. I was in my late 30s and working for one of the largest corporations in the world as kind of a middle manager. And my company had just been through a merger and acquisition, and I was pretty miserable. We were under my team had gone through almost 100% turnover,
Oh, wow.
and I was under immense stress, and I wasn't sleeping for like a week plus because of the intense stress I was under. And I was like, this is not okay for me. As someone who lives with bipolar disorder, this type of mental health strain on my mental health is life threatening, and I was like, I cannot do this anymore. And I until up until that point had been hiding my bipolar disorder from my workplace, right? I was not in a place to disclose. I had been hiding my diagnosis from like it was from every aspect of life, right? The stigma was so strong. I was afraid that if my workplace found out that I wouldn't advance, that people would treat me differently. And it was really a kind of I had already at that point started the journey to become a mental health advocate. Like a few years before that, I joined NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I had become a support group leader. So I was starting to find my voice as a mental health advocate, but I couldn't believe that I was in that extremely difficult place and feeling like I couldn't say why this was not okay for me. Like this was why being in that position was life threatening, even though I was this really high achieving individual with a master's degree and all this work experience, like why this was dangerous for me. Um, and I also, it was a time to reflect that like, how did I get here? I didn't strive to become a corporate, worker, and yet there I was, and I really reflected on my life and asked myself, like, what is the meaning of my life? What is the calling of my life? And I realized that it was to share my story. When I was first diagnosed at age 20, I was terrified and I didn't know if I would have a future. I didn't know if I had any right to have any hope for a future. There was so much shame, and I went to the library. There was no books that I could find by an Asian American authors, that I just wanted to find someone who like led a normal life. And at that time, it was really hard. But that was the year 2000. And Toni Morrison said, if you want to read a book that hasn't been written, you must write it, right? And so that's when I
Yeah.
started to write my story.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so interesting. And I think when your book ends, you were still in the nonprofit world, right?
Um, yes.
Yeah. So that's interesting. But
Well,
also I
I
just
mean,
want
I was I? No, because I wasn't I was in nonprofit, and then I slowly got pulled into
oh, okay.
corporate world.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I know you were also an adoption consultant for a little
yeah,
while in the
yeah,
story, which
yeah.
I find personally also very
Mm-hmm.
interesting from my
Yeah.
own journey. Um, and I'll just a quick side note is that the library is also doing outreach at the NAMI walk on Saturday here in Tucson.
Great.
So again, we're sort of tied into um, supporting and trying to destigmatize mental health
Yes.
as a library system as well. Um,
Wonderful.
did you, because I think about when folks write memoirs, how do they go back and collect details. And I don't know if you had any diaries to reference. David Sedaris is infamous for keeping copious diary material. Did you have to go through a specific process to try to reconnect with folks that could help you piece together your past, or were there any hesitations about um, going back to connect with folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have always been cursed and gifted with a very good memory in that like I remember a lot of detail. My parents always said, forget all this unnecessary things, and I would just hang on to a lot of memory. So that's something that I always had. And
Oh, that's great.
so I did tap into just my memory a lot. There was a lot of memories that came back to me in writing. I did have some diary, not a lot. I wrote when I was younger, but they were actually at my parents' house in Arizona, and most of this book was written in Seattle, where I lived. And so I didn't really have access to those diaries, but I did actually have quite a few emails to reference. I don't really delete my emails, and so I have a ton of emails in my inbox. And so I was able to tap into some of those. And I did
Yeah.
have some difficult conversations with my brother, just like understanding where he was during those moments, because I know that like how I remember many of the scenes that I write in the book, but what he was feeling in those parts of our lives was
Mm,
some very emotional conversations.
interesting.
And as far as whether I found had any trepidation, I think though the writing of this memoir was such a strong calling for me that there wasn't really much trepidation, to be honest. And my brother gave me the blanket permission. You can write whatever you want,
Oh,
And,
nice. Yeah.
yeah,
So totally supportive. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
What do you think was the most challenging aspect of writing your memoir?
Um, well, it really, I mean, honestly, was writing the most traumatic and difficult parts of my life, sharing those. Of course, I had processed them in therapy for years before coming to write them. But even processing it further and writing it in a way that I thought would be accessible to readers and would be usable for readers, because I always thought about it that way. Like I didn't want to write from a point of catharsis only, because that would be writing for me. And I didn't write this story for me. Like I wanted people to hopefully find it helpful, and so I always had the reader in mind.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice. I liked and maybe it's just my ADHD brain, but like the short chapter format, and
Yeah.
that each chapter has a little theme attached to it. So, um, I find that actually is really, really nice and helps, especially when processing challenging scenes, being able to take a break sometimes, but go
Yeah.
back because the chapters are shorter is really
That
nice.
was very much intentional, so
Oh,
thank you
love
so much
that.
for calling that out. I put a lot of energy. There was like a dozen rewrites of the manuscript to get to where it is today. And I even paid attention to like dark moments versus lighter moments and make sure that there
Ah,
was like enough balance, so that it doesn't get too dark at any all at once all together. I didn't want it to be like that because I wanted the book to ultimately be optimistic and hopeful, because there's not enough mental health narratives that are,
mm, yeah.
optimistic and hopeful. I think there's a lot of trauma porn, kind of like dark dark stories, and we don't really I don't need to contribute to more of
Oh,
that.
I
Yeah.
understand. Well, and one of my favorite passages is at the end, but maybe I'll read a couple sentences of it because I love the affirmation at the end, and I think it's something we could definitely all benefit from. Um, had you ever thought about fictionalizing your story versus making it a memoir, or what was the reason behind the choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it was terrifying because if you imagine, I was hiding, this was my biggest, darkest secret, that I live with bipolar disorder, that it was my skeleton in my closet for like 20 years. And for me to suddenly share it with the whole world, it was terrifying to do. And I did go through, is there any way I could do it under a pen name or,
Oh, yeah.
fictionalize it or something? I thought about that. But first and foremost, I'm writing this as a mental health advocate. And the reason why I am writing this memoir is to fight stigma and tell people that there's nothing to be ashamed of, that your life is not over because you have a diagnosis. You can still live a full, happy life with
Mm,
bipolar disorder or other mental health conditions. And there's no way I could do that while hiding behind a fiction label, and saying that my story's made up when it's not, right? Because it's like, yeah, why tell your truth and then say that it's fiction?
oh,
I
that makes
couldn't do
total
that.
sense.
Yeah, I couldn't do
Yeah,
that. And I couldn't use a pen name. It's my story. I had to use my face. I'm not ashamed, Yeah.
that's awesome. Was it cathartic? I know we talked about some of the painful scenes, and um, wondering, was the process of writing through and reflecting back cathartic for you, or was it um, painful and sort of had to slog through to ensure the completeness of it?
It was definitely very painful. There were certainly scenes that I would force myself to write
Mm.
because I knew that I needed to write it. And then afterwards, I would be bedridden for a week, like for days. And it was really hard, especially I had a young child, I have a family, people who depend on me. And um, it was very, very difficult. And it didn't happen just once. There was like, because there's, multiple scenes, multiple parts. And yeah, it was very hard to sustain. Um, but, I'm glad I did it, obviously. And it was healing. I will say it wasn't cathartic, but it was healing because there was I processed it further than I had already processed previously with
Mm,
therapy, and there were other realizations that I gained after
oh, that's
writing
true.
it because this was like I could really take my time and examine a lot of details and so it was very enlightening and healing, but
Did
painful. Yeah.
Were you able to have a self-care routine or embed some self-care throughout the writing?
Yeah, I mean, after some of that, I stopped forcing myself.
Mm,
I would allow myself when my body was telling me stop, I would actually listen because it was
mm,
when I would get sick was I was trying to meet a deadline and try and push myself too hard, and that's when I would get sick. And so later on, I started just, listening to myself more, being softer with my deadlines, whether it was like self-imposed or for a contest or whatever. Um, and baths were really helpful. I think a lot of writers I've read really seem to like baths, like the water is
mm.
healing and yeah, really just taking time and writing is a privilege. There's a reason why um the literary field isn't very diverse. It's because you need privilege to be able to write because no one's paying you usually while you're writing your book. And so I had the privilege to write full time. I quit my corporate job and wrote full time. Um, I was a freelance writer and editor while working on my book and taking care of
Wow.
my child, so I was busy, but
Yeah.
but I was able to. I didn't have another day job like I do now. Like most writers have another day job
Mm.
also on top of all that. So my self-care was not having a day job, I think. Yeah, and being able to kind of limit my writing more or less to work hours and still have like my evenings with family and things like that. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Having a
Yeah.
balance and boundaries.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, so this book addresses so many layers of issues and being Asian American, um, as I am as well, and facing questions of where are you from or what are you? Sometimes people would, um, maybe not so much anymore, but I recall a time when people would ask me, what are you? Um, are challenging enough to answer because we know really what people are wanting to know, which is trying to compartmentalize who they think we are with a cultural identity. But you had extra layers because your family is ethnically Chinese but residing in Korea, where you were born. So, were there a lot of challenges for you growing up in trying to explain your identity to folks, or did you find ways to explain it in a way that would kind of help um, move the conversation along, I guess?
Yeah, it was difficult because it is, and it still is, because it's if I want to, it's just very challenging with my background to be brief with it. Like I'm Chinese but born in Korea. Um, it is like what I end up saying, but it's like hard to open that can of worms and not have people ask more questions or yeah, I did have challenges. I was the only Asian kid in class most of the time growing up in, suburbs of Phoenix. Yeah, got a lot of taunts. In my book I write about some threatening crank calls that I would get from kids, right? That were very painful. Um, and yeah, it like you said, it is hard to explain. Once I got older, I started just say where if people ask me where I'm from, the short answer would be I'm from Phoenix.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
just like would leave it. And by then, by the time I was an adult, people knew to leave it there. Um, but usually I think I would kind of gauge a person and sort of try to understand like why they were asking, and
Yeah,
if I like them more, if I think yeah, if I trusted them or trusted their intention a little bit, then maybe I would give them a little more, like I'm ethnic Chinese but born in Korea, but I immigrated when I was 9. It's just like it's
yeah,
just so long, it's impossible to share that answer without seeming like I'm telling them my life story.
I
Yeah.
understand. I
Yeah. I'm sure
um
you have the same thing as an
I
adoptee.
definitely did.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was layers of, okay, where was I born or where did I just
Yeah.
move from? Because we also my family moved around the country a bit, so I would be like, I
Same.
was born in Korea, but I've lived here all my life, but I'm adopted. But um, are you trying to ask me like what do I identify with culturally? Because I'll say American.
Right.
So,
Hmm.
um, but um, I also remember people would be like, "No, where are you really from?" If I was like, "Oh, I'm from St. Louis," depending on where I was living at the time. "No, where are
Yeah.
you really from?" I'd be like, "Okay, are you asking where was I born?"
Hmm.
Um, so it is trying to dig to what the intention of the person is.
Yeah.
Um, Strangers don't get quite the courtesy that maybe, acquaintances or friends or business colleagues who were trying to really get to know me. Um,
Right.
so I get that you have different answers for different
Yeah. Definitely
different
different answers for
audience.
different audiences. Yeah.
Um, I had lived in Korea for a year, and I was pretty aware, even back then in 2007 to 2008, that the beauty standards were um, pretty near to impossible to meet, um, to the point that women put on full makeup and glitzy outfits to go to the gym. Um, and I was curious because I had an interview with another author who was talking about her freckles and how in Korea they were seen as a skin flaw, but endearing here in America. So, um, what do you, I guess, feel in terms of US beauty standards versus Korean beauty standards, or Asian standards in general? Um, I think your book referenced whitening lotion. And I remember seeing those on the shelves in Korea, so it was crazy to me to see the difference in expectations. But um, what are your thoughts on?
Yeah. Absolutely. Korean beauty standards are tough. And I just came back from Korea, as you know. I just spent a week there and just got back last week. And yeah, it's still tough. It's just such a
Mhm.
culture that strives for perfection and everybody being um, very much alike, right? Very much the same.
Yeah,
And when, it's cold there and it was a sea of black North Face puffer jackets. Like everybody had the same coat. And all black, all black. There was no color variation
oh,
even,
interesting.
and yeah, it's so much about labels there, right? Designer labels. And yeah, it is very challenging. And I think that US, and I grew up, yes, I did write about whitening lotion because my dad forced me to wear it when I was a teen. A lot of my book is about it is the Korean beauty standard through my dad imposed on me, and like
Mhm.
my body size was not acceptable for Korea, right? And obesity is a problem globally. And, Korea also is having more size diversity there as I go back this time.
That's
It's been
awesome.
6 years since I've been back. And so I don't get as much stares, which is good. And so I was like, well, that's good. I like once in a while I would see someone who's about my size and I would feel comforted. And every time yeah, I would keep my eye out. Yeah, so it is very difficult in Korea to live in that very strict society when it comes to
Mhm.
how you're supposed to look. Even when I went to Taiwan after, like I know that Taiwan is always more relaxed about that. I mean, Taiwan also has their beauty standards too, but it's
Oh, yeah.
not as strict as Korea. Taiwan is a little more relaxed and letting people do what they want, you know? Yeah, there's no black North Face jackets. Everybody's, wearing different things and pretty wacky things
Yeah.
sometimes.
I think
And but
when
that's like an expression of their freedom. And
stunning,
so
yeah.
you could just feel the kind of a sigh of relief, like more relaxation there, which I thought was really interesting. And the UN actually, when I came back, showed me all these reports that Taiwan was voted the happiest place in Asia,
Oh, wow.
and Korea is like number 7 or 8.
Oh,
And
that's funny.
so I was like, I could feel it having just been to those two places. And as far as like US beauty standards, you asked me how they compare. US beauty standards I think was pretty rough, like in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, which is where a lot of my memoir takes place. Like I look back on like whether it's movies or music videos or anything and just see how thin the women were back then as well. So I think it's great that there's more understanding now in the US. There's the body positivity movement, the listen to your body, the intuitive eating sort of type
Eating,
of
yeah.
movement. And there's more attempts in pop culture to represent diversity in size, in race, all of it. And so I know it's not perfect, but I think um, people know here have a deeper philosophy and understanding here and are trying. So yeah, that gives me hope.
Yeah. Uh, um, more broad representation in commercials
Yeah,
and TV and people like Lizzo and
absolutely.
celebrities that are um, visually flaunting their bodies regardless of the size.
Yeah.
Um, when I lived in Korea, I taught English at a hagwon, which are the private schools, as you know, that Korean parents send their kids to after their regular school and on weekends to learn English or math or whatever other subjects they needed for high school entrance or college entrance. Like high school competition is a thing in Korea, so it's really interesting. But I remember the teachers having wooden rods banded together that they use for corporal punishment. And some of the kids would tell me that they had to hold their arms up as punishment for hours, um, or that they would get beatings at home if their grades were poor. Um, and so I assumed that corporal punishment was just kind of baked into the culture itself in Korea. And throughout the book, of course, we see that your father was a representative of that and implemented corporal punishment. But you also talked about your uncle in a very positive way who didn't want to perpetuate the abuse that it turns out your grandfather had inflicted on your dad and uncles. So maybe there's a desire to break the expectation. Um, do you feel, since you've recently been back, that this is the new norm? Or do you think that corporal punishment is still kind of an expectation?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to speak on behalf of all like Korean households,
I know,
especially
sorry.
since I did not grow up in a Korean household, Chinese Korean household who is later moved to America. But as far as, what is the norm? I mean, my book talks about, not to be like spoiler, but like how it became illegal. The Korean government made it illegal for schools to practice corporal punishment
Oh, that's yeah.
um, across the country. And that was huge. Like, that's why it's the ending of my book, because that was like just such a weight lifted off my shoulders, off my heart. Like, to know that my cousins did not have to endure what I endured, what like generations endured. Um, I know it's just at school, but I mean, if it's not the norm at school, then I think like I do, like my uncle is younger than my dad, right? And so I do think that like later generations do not because they were raised under corporal punishment, under that trauma, like they don't want to pass that on to their kids. And so I do think that it is changing. There's a lot of progress. And speaking of Hagwons, my uncle told me during this last trip, it was a total shock to me that Hagwons have been banned in Korea too,
Wow.
because part of the reason being it was so horrible for the
Yeah.
children's mental health that they're in school and then in Hagwon like all day long, you know? And yeah, we know Korea has some
Wow,
of the
that's
highest
amazing.
suicide rates. Korea has
Yeah.
some of the suicide rates, and it affects the young people as well. So I mean, that is huge change, huge progress, right?
Wow,
So
yeah.
I do think there's change and you know, a lot of reflection happening.
That's nice. It did concern the Western teachers that the kids didn't ever seem to have, like, playtime or
Yeah,
fu
yeah,
or fun, just
yeah,
actual literal, just, like, it's after school,
yeah,
but now you have 3 to 4 more hours
yeah,
of class plus then studying when they get home,
yeah.
um,
Yeah, my
so
uncle said they're very limited now, which Hagwons were allowed.
wow.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that is great. Um, what advice would you give someone who wants to start their own, um, memoir, um or any kind of debut book, but do you have some specific advice for someone who wants to write their memoir, like something you would have done differently, or you now reflecting back on your process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I know a lot of people, it's like, are you a pantser or are you a plotter, right? Like I was absolutely an outliner. I wrote a mission statement for my memoir
Wow.
before I started writing. So I know not everyone's going to approach writing like I did, but I think that is a good question to ask though, is like, what are you trying to achieve with your book?
Mm,
Like, why are you writing this book? I think having a clear knowledge of that will help, you know, as you write your story. Like, is it purely for entertainment? Are you, you know, writing to share your story, you know, for advocacy reasons? Like, you know, what identify what it's for. I know a lot of authors give the advice of just start writing, and I think that is a great place to start if you're stuck or you know you just want to get something down because it is so much easier to edit than to start something anew.
oh, interesting. Yeah.
Um, but as if you are writing a memoir, um, I believe that it's shouldn't be for catharsis. Like I've said this before,
Mm,
I think that I want to respect the reader's time more than that, you know, because I think that the processing of your trauma should be done with your therapist, you know, and and I think it shouldn't just be like a uh, maybe not regurgitation, but some, you know, you shouldn't just be telling the detail of everything that happened to you and how bad it was to your reader. I think because I maybe that's just my point of view of like, is that trauma porn? You know, like
mm,
to me, it shouldn't be about what you went through, but about how you survived. And so that's how I approached writing my story.
mm.
And I always had in mind how will this writing serve the reader was
Nice.
always in my
Yeah,
mind. Yeah.
that's a great way to think about it. It's it's hard because there are so many more um, stories being shared out there, and the landscape looks so much more diverse. So it is exciting to see there is greater diversity in not just memoirs, but also um, new fiction and sci-fi, horror, and other genres. But we're at this weird dichotomy where we're experiencing a lot of book challenges and book bans at the same time. Um, do you feel optimistic about the future of diverse storytelling?
I do feel optimistic. Yeah, I am optimistic. Um, if nothing else, because it is easier now to self-publish and self-promote, I think, more than ever. I myself had a non-traditional publishing journey.
Mm.
I am and was agented, and my book went on submission to all the big publishers for a year. And I just kept hearing over and over from the publishers that they are just printing something exactly like my book. And I'm like,
Oh,
how can that be?
how
Because
yeah,
it's my life story. And it was very hurtful and very hard to accept because,
Oh,
I don't know if you've heard from other writers, but being on submission is like the worst kind of torture anyway. And then
oh,
to have all the feedback be like, oh no, we already have a million books just like yours, and I'm like, but
oh,
it's
wow.
not true. I know it's not true. I'm
Yeah.
a reader, you know.
Do you feel like that was the thinly veiled, we
We
reached
have
our
an Asian
quota of
book.
AAPI
Yeah,
authors?
we have
Yeah,
an Asian
yeah,
book.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know there are more books now from Asian American writers about mental health, some wonderful ones like Stephanie Fu's What My Bones Know about complex PTSD. I don't know if you've read it. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. Yeah, there are other books out, but I think there's room for mine. Like how many books are there by, blonde,
Yeah.
white lady writers, like there are so many. But yeah, so um, after that 1 year on submission, we went so wide. And in the publishing industry, once you've submitted a book, you can't resubmit to the same publisher for like
Oh,
7 years or
oh
something
my
like that. They
gosh.
don't want,
Okay.
yeah, they don't want to see it again if it's the same book. And so I basically took my shot and it didn't take. And so even though I am now under different representation with a Korean American agent, and I really wish I had signed with her to begin with, my first agent was amazing. She believed in me, but she was very old school. And I'm grateful to her for making my journey real because she was the first one to say yes. Um, but I think I would have done things a little bit differently had I had do I if I had the opportunity to do it again. Um, but my agent's recommendation, my current agent, the Korean American one, was to shelf this memoir, and work on another work. And I needed to get this story out. Like it's not why I wrote it. Wasn't to make sure it has a big five publisher. I really just wanted to reach people and help people and get it on library shelves specifically. And lucky enough, I happened to move to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we have our library system has their own press, has their own publisher, and
Ah,
so and they accepted my book, and it's been an amazing journey from there on. And so there are so many different ways to get your book out into the world. So that's why I am optimistic about diverse storytelling because, yes, you will hear a lot of no's, no matter who you are,
mm,
no
mm.
matter how privileged you are. But if you don't give up, then there's a way.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's super encouraging for people out there. And you mentioned one book. I know you're obviously very busy with your family and work as well. But do you have other current or recent book recommendations, or are there authors that you're currently following?
Absolutely. I am just, it's so in awe of E.J. Cole, who wrote The Magical Language of Others, and her new novel. That's a memoir, but she has a novel out too called The Liberators. No one writes like E.J. Cole. She is amazing. Grace Talusan is a mentor of mine. She wrote The Body Papers. That is really, really amazing. I recently read Daughters of Sendong by Eve J. Chung. So I'm a daughter of Sendong as well. And I've
Mm.
never read a book that was like specifically about my province quite like that.
Oh,
So
interesting.
it was
Yeah.
super cool, super cool. So yeah, I read a lot of memoirs and books by Asian American authors, but I'm always reading. I'm always have an audiobook going. And so like I love One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston is a great escape book, you
Oh,
know, it's
okay.
so fun, so fun. Yeah.
They were
So
just at
yeah.
the Tucson Festival of Books.
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
I saw that. Yeah, which I will be at next year.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Okay.
So super excited.
We'd be happy to also do um, a pre-promo for your visit then, and also highlight or spotlight any other projects that you're working on prior to your Festival of Books. I'm assuming you'll be a presenting author.
Yeah, I'm considered an indie author. I was accepted under the indie
Oh, great.
author program because my press is a small press and not a big one. I was actually accepted for this year, but I had to defer because of going to Asia.
Oh, right.
And
Yes.
so they were so kind to accept um, and allow me to come back next year instead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll be happy to highlight the fact that you'll be there
Okay.
next year in advance of it. Um, and I just wanted to conclude our interview with and I know it's at the very end, so I won't read all of it, but I love the positivity and the affirmation um, of the nearest to the end a chapter where you say, I'm a fighter, a friend, a lover, a sister, and a soon to be mother. The fight is not over. I'm still working on my issues, but I am worthy. I am enough. Um, and what I find lovely about that is the I'm still working on my issues part of it. We're all in this journey. No, no one's perfect, but those of us who struggle with either anxiety or depression or bipolar or other mental health or neurodivergence or just trying to fit into this world, that it's a journey. Um, and I love that about your book and that it's sort of infers a continuance of um, working through things. And I don't know if you follow Michael Threet's, but he is also he came from the library world and he's a big proponent of mental health destigmatization and has been very upfront with his own. Um, and so it's just lovely to see that there's just more discussion about all of it. Um, and before we conclude, were there any last thoughts or comments you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, I this has been lovely. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful questions, Nikki. It's been really, really wonderful to connect with you. Yeah, my dream is just for my book to reach the people that need it. So I guess your audience will be the Tucson, the Pima County Library, Public Library System, which already I'm so excited, bought several
Ah,
copies of my book for distribution. So it's,
awesome.
available to check out through your library system. But yeah, if by chance other people who belong to other libraries are watching this and would request it for their library, I would really, really appreciate that because that was me, the terrified kid, going down the library aisle trying to find a single person who was okay after a bipolar diagnosis. And I couldn't find someone.
Mhm.
And so I wrote this as an example of like, yes, I'm just a normal person, but that's all I wanted to know at age 20, that like, and after being hospitalized, that it's like, no, you can still be a normal person and have all the things that normal people go after, and not feel like it's a death sentence, not feel like you have no hope. I think that the reason why there's such high suicide rate for people with severe mental health conditions is the stigma, is the belief that there's no future, and that's why they give up. But that's why we have to share more stories like us that no, it's not the end, but it's the stigma that keeps us quiet. It's the stigma that makes those of us who are living full lives hide our mental health condition like I did for 20 years, um, for fear that like once you're exposed, then then you would lose what you built. But that perpetuates a cycle of keeping everyone in the dark. And so, yeah,
Well,
I'm just hopeful that my book will become accessible to people.
I hope so too. I think it's great. We'll enjoy having you share in person, coming back to a place that you lived in the past, back to Tucson. But I really appreciate your sharing, not just during this interview, but through the book as well, and just having the courage to have your story out there for the rest of us. So thank you so very much for spending some time, and we look forward to seeing you at the author talk.
Thank you so much, Nikki. It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Same.